I don't know why you people always come here thinking we owe you something. This is a private hospital, not a community clinic. You need to go back downstairs and wait like everyone else. Sir, you either see yourself downstairs or I call the hospital security to throw you out.
Please look into these files. We are meant to be with the doctor 30 minutes ago.
Security! Sir, if you don't go downstairs, I will scream.
There are things that medical school does not teach, not because the professors do not know them, but because the professors have spent so many years inside institutions that tell them what is possible and what is not possible, that they have stopped being able to see the space between those two things, the space where the impossible lives, the space where a 13-year-old girl from the west side of Atlanta with a second-hand medical textbook and a mind that had been eating knowledge since before she could properly pronounce the words for it. The space where that girl could reach in and do something that 7 of the world's most credentialed surgeons had never managed to do without losing the patient. This is the story of that space, and of Trisha Cole, and of what happened on a Tuesday morning in October at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center, when the building full of prestigious degrees and expensive equipment, and people who had been told their entire careers that they were the best, when all of that was not enough. And a 13-year-old girl in stolen surgical scrubs locked a door and picked up a scalpel, and the world held its breath. The Cole family arrived at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center at 8:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, which was 45 minutes before Diana Cole's 9 a.m. appointment with Dr. Raymond Holt, which was itself the product of 6 weeks of phone calls and 2 letters, and 1 visit to the hospital's patient services office, in which Marcus Cole had stood at the counter for 40 minutes, while the woman behind the desk found reasons not to look up from her computer. And the 45 minutes of early arrival was Diana's idea, because Diana Cole had learned, in the specific way that Black women in America learn certain things, through accumulated experience rather than single dramatic lessons, that arriving early at places that do not expect to see you is one of the ways you demonstrate that you cannot be dismissed, that you took it seriously enough to come early, that you prepared, that you are not the person they are already deciding you are before you open your mouth. But Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center was the kind of building that communicated its expectations before anyone inside it said a word. It was 42 stories of glass and steel on Peachtree Street in the heart of Midtown Atlanta, its lobby a cathedral of marble and recessed lighting, and the specific temperature of rooms maintained for the comfort of people who are accustomed to comfort. The automatic doors opened with a soft hydraulic sigh into an atrium that smelled of money and disinfectant in equal measure, and the Cole family walked through those doors, Marcus first, then Diana, then Trisha, and the lobby arranged itself around them, the way lobbies in buildings like this one arrange themselves around families like theirs, which is to say it did not rearrange at all. They simply entered a space that had not been designed with them in mind, and moved through it with the specific dignified self-consciousness of people who know they are being assessed and have decided to carry themselves as though they are not. Marcus Cole was 41 years old and worked 2 jobs days at a sheet metal fabrication plant in Decatur and evenings 3 times a week driving for a delivery service. And Marcus Cole was wearing his good jacket, the one Diana pressed the night before, the one that was 5 years old but showed it less than the others because it had been worn less than the others, preserved for occasions that required it. And Marcus was carrying Diana's medical folder, a thick manila envelope stuffed with test results and referral letters and insurance documents, and the specific paperwork accumulation of a family navigating a medical system that moved slowly for people who could not afford to pay it to move faster. Diana Cole was 39 years old and had been a teacher's aide at Westview Elementary School for 11 years before the symptoms started, before the headaches that came in the night and stayed through the morning, before the tremors in her left hand that she had managed to hide from her students for 3 months before the school principal noticed and said gently that Diana might want to consider taking some time. And Diana had taken some time. and Diana had gone to the family doctor, who was a good man with a small practice and limited equipment, who had run the tests he could run, and had said what he could say, and had ultimately written the referral letter to Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center that Marcus had spent 6 weeks turning into an appointment. Because a referral letter from a small practice family doctor to the most prestigious hospital in Georgia did not open doors automatically. It sat in someone's inbox. And it required phone calls, and letters, and 40 minutes at a patient services counter, but they were here now. 8:15 a.m., 45 minutes early, and Tricia Cole was 13 years old. Tricia was the kind of child that teachers described in the specific, slightly bewildered language of educators encountering something outside their framework. Gifted was the word they used most often, the word that educational systems reach for when they mean something larger but do not have a more precise vocabulary for it. Because gifted was the word for children who scored well on standardized tests and read above their grade level. And Tricia did those things. She read 4 grade levels above her actual grade, scored in the 99th percentile on every assessment her school administered, and had an observable memory that her 6th grade science teacher had described to Marcus and Diana during a parent-teacher conference as the kind of thing you read about in case studies. But gifted did not quite cover what Tricia was, because gifted implied a thing that had been given, a passive receiving of exceptional capacity. And what Tricia had was not passive. What Tricia had was the specific, active, relentless hunger of a mind that found the world genuinely and deeply interesting at every level and in every direction and could not stop pulling at it to see what was underneath. She read everything, not selectively, everything. The backs of cereal boxes, the instruction manuals for appliances they did not own, the neighborhood library's entire nonfiction section organized by Dewey Decimal. She had read every book in the children's section by the time she was 8, and had spent the subsequent 5 years working through the adult sections with the methodical appetite of someone who understood that time was finite and knowledge was not. And she had found the medical textbook when she was 11, in a dumpster behind the Morehouse School of Medicine on Westview Drive, on a Tuesday afternoon when she was walking home from the library. The dumpster was full of outdated curriculum materials from a department reorganization, old editions, superseded by newer versions, discarded with the casual efficiency of institutions that can afford to replace things. And Tricia had pulled the textbook out of the dumpster and looked at the cover. And the cover said, Advanced Principles of Cardiovascular and Neurological Surgery, 3rd edition. And Tricia had put the book in her backpack, and Tricia had read it 4 times. Not the way most people read things they are not required to read, skimming, absorbing general impressions, losing the thread in the technical sections. Tricia read the way she read everything, which was with the full, focused application of a mind that treated every page as a puzzle to be completely solved before the next page was turned. She made notes in the margins in her own shorthand. She drew diagrams. She cross-referenced passages against each other, and against the anatomy textbook she had checked out of the library 6 times before the librarian, Ms. Elaine Washington, had quietly purchased a second copy and marked Tricia's name on the waiting list as permanent. And when she reached the section on ventriculosynaptic collapse syndrome, 47 pages in Chapter 12, the most technical and demanding chapter in the book, the chapter that her margin notes indicated she had read 6 separate times, Tricia had written at the top of page 312, in the careful block letters she used when she wanted to remember something precisely. 7 surgeons. World. 40-minute window. Neural pathway reconnection. Do not lose the signal. She did not know, at 11 years old, reading a discarded textbook in her bedroom on the west side of Atlanta, that she was writing herself a note she would need at 13. But she was. Now Tricia walked through the lobby of Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center beside her parents and looked at everything with the specific comprehensive attention she brought to every new environment. The layout, the signage, the flow of people, the location of the information desk. The corridor that led to the elevators, the separate corridor that led to the stairs, the glass-walled administrative offices visible behind the reception area, the nursing station to the left, the waiting area to the right with its chairs arranged in rows and its television mounted high on the wall showing a morning news program that nobody was watching. And Tricia looked at all of this in approximately 12 seconds and filed it completely. And then Tricia looked at the reception desk. And the woman behind the reception desk, whose name tag read Beverly, and who was perhaps 35, and had the specific quality of surface pleasantness that is deployed as a screening mechanism, rather than a genuine orientation toward other people, looked at the Cole family as they approached. And Beverly's face did something that was not dramatic and was not rude in any way that could be pointed to specifically, but was visible to anyone who had spent their life learning to read rooms, a slight adjustment, a recalibration of the level of attentiveness she was prepared to offer, a settling into the particular register of minimal engagement. And Marcus Cole stepped up to the desk and said, "Good morning. We have a 9 a.m. appointment with Dr. Holt. The name is Cole, Diana Cole." And Beverly looked at her computer screen, and Beverly typed something, and Beverly looked at the screen for a moment longer than the task required. And then Beverly said, "I am going to need you to go to the second floor registration office. They handle new patient check-ins." And Marcus said, "We were told to check in at the main desk. That is what the appointment confirmation letter says." And Beverly said, without looking up from her screen, "Policy changed. Second floor. Elevator is to your left." And Marcus looked at the letter in the manila envelope. And Marcus looked at the desk. And Marcus said, "All right, thank you." And Marcus turned with Diana and Tricia and walked toward the elevator. And Beverly watched them go and then turned back to her screen. And Tricia, walking beside her father toward the elevator, had noted the time on the clock above the reception desk. 8:17 a.m. And Tricia was already thinking about the second floor. The second floor registration office was not where Beverly had sent them. Or rather, the second floor registration office existed, but it handled billing disputes and insurance verification, not new patient check-ins. And the woman at the second floor registration desk, whose name tag read Helen and who was perhaps 50 and wore the expression of someone who had been doing a job she found beneath her for a very long time, looked at Marcus Cole when he explained their situation and said, "New patient check-ins are on the main floor, at the main desk." And Marcus said, very carefully, "The woman at the main desk sent us up here." And Helen said, "Well, that is not correct. You need to go back downstairs." And Marcus said, "Can you call down and let them know we are coming so we do not get sent back up again?" And Helen looked at him for a moment. And Helen said, "I cannot make calls for other departments. That is not my job." And Marcus Cole stood at the second floor registration desk with his wife's thick manila envelope under his arm, and his good pressed jacket, and the specific expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life learning to manage the rage that accumulates when systems treat you as an inconvenience rather than a person, managing it not by suppressing it, but by redirecting it into the focused, controlled, absolutely impeccable presentation of someone who will not give any room any excuse to dismiss him. And Marcus said, "Thank you for your time." And Marcus turned back to his family. And Diana had been standing throughout this exchange with her hand on Tricia's shoulder, not for her own support, though the headache had started on the drive over and the fluorescent lighting on the second floor was not helping, but because Tricia's hand, visible at her side, had been closing slowly into a fist since Helen said, "That is not my job." And Diana's hand on Tricia's shoulder was a message. The message was, "I see it too, and we are not doing it here." And Tricia, who could read her mother the way she read everything completely and precisely, had opened her fist, but her jaw was set. They went back down to the main floor, and Beverly was not at the main desk. A different woman was younger, wearing a headset, talking on the phone, and she looked up when the Coles approached and held up one finger to indicate that they should wait. And they waited. And the woman finished her call and looked at them and said, "How can I help you?" And Marcus explained. And the woman, whose name tag read Crystal, looked at the computer and said, "Oh, I see you right here. Cole, 9 a.m. with Dr. Holt. You just needed to check in here." And Crystal printed a form and handed Marcus a pen. And Marcus filled out the form with the controlled steadiness of a man who had learned that paperwork in difficult systems is a form of combat, and that neat, complete, correct paperwork is the most effective weapon in that particular arsenal. And the form was completed and returned, and Crystal gave them visitor badges and directed them to the 5th floor waiting room for Dr. Holt's department. And the Cole family went to the elevator. And on the elevator, Marcus let out a long, slow breath through his nose. And Diana looked at him. And Diana said, "We are here. That is what matters." And Marcus looked at his wife, her face, which was thinner than it had been 6 months ago, the shadows under her eyes that the 11 years of morning classroom energy had previously masked, but that showed more clearly now, and Marcus said, "Yes, that is what matters." And Tricia, standing between her parents, looked up at the elevator floor indicator ticking upward toward 5. And Tricia said nothing. But Tricia was thinking about everything she had seen on the main floor in those 12 seconds of arrival. The layout, the corridors, the nursing station, the glass-walled offices. And Tricia was filing it in the specific way she filed useful information, which was with the implicit tag of "might need this later." The 5th floor waiting room was well appointed in the way that waiting rooms in prestigious hospitals are well appointed: comfortable chairs, soft lighting, a coffee and water station, prints of Georgia landscape on the walls. And it was approximately half full when the Coles arrived at 8:35. And the family took seats near the window, and Marcus went to the coffee station and brought back 2 cups, one for Diana, one for himself. And Tricia took out the book she had brought, which was a second-hand copy of Gray's Anatomy, 38th edition, that she had found at a used book sale at the library 2 months ago, and which she was currently on her 3rd read-through. And they sat. And they waited. At 9:15 the Coles were still waiting. At 9:30 Marcus went to the nursing station at the front of the waiting room and told the nurse, a heavy-set woman in her 40s named Nurse Patricia Greer, whose name tag Tricia had read from across the room, that their 9 a.m. appointment was now 30 minutes past due, and he wanted to understand when Dr. Holt would be available. And Nurse Greer looked up from her station with the expression of a woman who has decided before the conversation begins that whoever is speaking to her is taking up time she does not have. And Nurse Greer said, "Dr. Holt is a very busy physician. We see patients in the order they check in. You will be called when he is ready." And Marcus said, "We checked in at 8:35 for a 9 a.m. appointment. It is now 9:30. And Nurse Greer said, "As I said, you will be called when he is ready." And Marcus said, "I understand he is busy. I am simply asking for an estimated time so my wife, who is not well, knows how much longer she will need to wait." And Nurse Greer said, "I cannot give you a time estimate. Please return to your seat." And Marcus returned to his seat. And Diana put her hand on his arm. And Diana said, "It is fine. I am fine." And Marcus looked at her face and the specific quality of the lines around her eyes that appeared when the headache was bad, and said nothing. And Tricia had watched all of this from her seat with her Gray's Anatomy open in her lap but her eyes on Nurse Greer's station. And Tricia had noted the time, 9:32 a.m. at 10:15, 1 hour and 15 minutes after the scheduled appointment time. A nurse appeared in the doorway of the waiting room and called, "Cole." And Marcus was on his feet immediately, and Diana stood carefully, one hand on the armrest. And Tricia closed her book and stood, and the 3 of them followed the nurse, a young woman named Destiny, who was perhaps 24, and who was the first person in the building to make eye contact with all 3 of them fully and say good morning, in a way that meant it, through the door, and down a corridor to an examination room. The examination room was clean and bright, and had the specific organized clinical efficiency of a space built for purpose rather than comfort. And the 3 Coles arranged themselves in it, Diana on the examination table, Marcus on the chair beside her, Tricia standing near the wall where she could see the room's full medical inventory. The blood pressure cuff on the wall, the ophthalmoscope in its bracket, the medication cabinet with its combination lock, the anatomical posters, the digital monitor cart in the corner with its array of diagnostic tools. And they waited again, for another 22 minutes. And then the door opened, and Dr. Raymond Holt came in. Dr. Raymond Holt was 55 years old and had been the chief of neurology at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center for 11 years, and had before that been on the faculty at Johns Hopkins, and before that had trained at Stanford, and had the specific quality of confident authority that comes from having been told you are exceptional for so long and by so many institutions that you have stopped distinguishing between the authority that was earned and the authority that was simply assumed. He was tall, silver-haired, wearing his white coat with the practiced ease of a garment that had become a second skin, and Dr. Holt walked into the examination room and looked at his tablet and said, "Mrs. Cole." And Diana said, "Yes." And Dr. Holt said, "I am Dr. Holt. I have reviewed your referral." And Dr. Holt looked at his tablet for another moment. And then Dr. Holt looked up and looked at Diana, and specifically at Diana's clothes, which were her best clothes, carefully chosen that morning, but which were not the clothes of the kind of patient that Dr. Holt's practice was oriented around. And something in Dr. Holt's face shifted in the same way Beverly's face had shifted at the reception desk. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration. And Dr. Holt said, "Your family doctor's referral mentions episodes of severe headache and left-hand tremors. How long has this been going on?" And Diana said, 8 months. The headache started in February and the tremors began in April. And Dr. Holt said, "Are you currently employed?" And Marcus said, "My wife was a teacher's aide until the symptoms became severe enough to require leave." And Dr. Holt said to his tablet rather than to Marcus, "And what insurance are you carrying?" And Marcus named the insurance. And Dr. Holt's stylus moved on the tablet. And Marcus watched the stylus move and understood what the movement meant, understood it with the specific comprehensive literacy of a man who has navigated medical systems while black and working class in America, which was that Dr. Holt was already calculating the billable ceiling of Diana's case and finding it insufficient for his full attention. And Tricia, standing near the wall, watched all of this. And Tricia watched Dr. Holt's physical examination of her mother, which was competent but brief, the examination of a man going through necessary steps rather than actually looking. And Tricia watched him listen to Diana's heart with his stethoscope for 4 seconds, which was not enough time. And Tricia watched him check Diana's reflexes, all of them, correctly administered, and saw the result of the left-hand reflex test, which showed a delay of approximately 300 milliseconds compared to the right hand. And Tricia's eyes moved to the anatomical poster on the wall showing the neural pathways of the upper extremities. And Tricia looked back at her mother. And Tricia's mouth opened slightly. And then Tricia closed her mouth. Because she was 13 years old and this was the most prestigious hospital in Georgia, and the man in the white coat had trained at Stanford and Johns Hopkins and had 11 years of authority in this room. And Tricia was 13. And she was her parents' daughter, which meant she understood, in the cellular way of children who have watched their parents navigate hostile systems, that this was not the moment. But Tricia kept watching. And Dr. Holt completed his examination and said he would order an MRI and some additional blood work, and that his office would be in contact about scheduling. And Marcus said, "When can we expect to hear about the scheduling?" And Dr. Holt said, "My office will reach out within 2 to 3 weeks." And Marcus said, "Dr. Holt, my wife has been experiencing progressive symptoms for 8 months. 2 to 3 weeks seems like a long time to wait for a scheduling call." And Dr. Holt looked at Marcus directly, for the first time since entering the room, with the expression of a man who has just been questioned by someone he did not expect to be questioned by. And Dr. Holt said, "We have a significant patient load, Mr. Cole. The timeline is what it is." And Dr. Holt said goodbye and walked out the door before anyone could respond. And the examination room was quiet for a moment. And Diana looked at Marcus. And Marcus looked at the door. And Tricia looked at the anatomical poster on the wall showing the neural pathways of the upper extremities and the specific diagram of the pathway between the cervical spine and the left brachial plexus. And Tricia said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "The delay in her left-hand reflex is not brachial. It is cervical. C6 and C7. That is not what he is looking for." And Marcus looked at his daughter. And Marcus said, "Tricia." And Tricia looked up from the poster. And Tricia said, "Sorry, Daddy." And Marcus said, "Come on, let us go." And the Cole family walked back through the corridor and through the waiting room and to the elevator. And on the elevator, Tricia stood between her parents and thought about C6 and C7 cervical neural compression, and about the specific pattern of symptom progression she had been quietly tracking in her mother for 3 months, and about what the pattern pointed toward, and about what the treatment for what it pointed toward required, and about the fact that Dr. Raymond Holt had not looked at the pattern at all because Dr. Raymond Holt had looked at Diana Cole's insurance and made a decision before his stethoscope touched her chest. And the elevator opened on the main floor, and the 3 Coles walked through the lobby toward the main entrance. And they were almost at the doors, almost outside, almost back in the October morning air when everything changed. The change began with a sound. Not a dramatic sound, not the sound of monitors alarming or people shouting, which were the sounds that drew attention in a hospital lobby. The change began with the sound of silence in a space that had been noise. A specific, sudden, cellular silence, the kind that spreads through a crowd when something has happened that the crowd has not yet processed but whose weight it has already felt. And the Cole family, almost at the exit, felt it, and Tricia turned first. Across the lobby, through the glass wall of the VIP wing corridor that Tricia had noted on arrival, the corridor that led to the private patient suites on the upper floors, the corridor that had a different quality of carpet and different quality of lighting than the main corridors, the corridor that had a security desk staffed by a man in a suit rather than a uniform. Through that glass wall, a group of people was moving with the urgent, organized chaos of a medical emergency in progress. 3 doctors in white coats running, 4 nurses behind them, a crash cart being pushed by someone Tricia could not see, and behind all of them, visible through the glass for just a moment before the group turned the corner toward the elevators, a woman, small, silver-haired, wearing the kind of clothes that costs more than Marcus Cole made in a month, and the woman's face was Tricia filed the word before she could stop herself, destroyed, not crying, past crying. The specific face of someone who has received news so catastrophic that the ordinary expressions of grief have not yet arrived, and what shows instead is a kind of raw, exposed blankness that is somehow worse than tears. And Tricia watched this through the glass wall for approximately 4 seconds. And then Tricia said, "Daddy." And Marcus, who had also turned, said, "What is it?" And Tricia said, "The man in the VIP suite. Something happened to him." And Diana said, "Tricia, we need to go." And Tricia said, "Mama, that woman, did you see her face?" And Diana had seen her face. And Diana looked at it for a moment through the glass, the silver-haired woman being guided by a nurse into a private waiting area. The nurse's hand on her arm in the specific way of someone managing a person who might fall, and Diana said, "Come on, baby. That is not our business." And Tricia nodded, and Tricia turned toward the exit. But Tricia's mind was already moving in a different direction, because Tricia had seen more than the woman's face in those 4 seconds. Tricia had seen the crash cart. And Tricia had seen the specific configuration of the medical team, the number of people, the urgency of their movement, the particular kind of running that doctors do when they are managing something that is not a heart attack or a stroke in the ordinary sense, because heart attacks and strokes have a specific team composition and a specific equipment configuration that Tricia had read about in the Advanced Principles book. And the team she had just seen through the glass was larger than those situations required, and the equipment on the crash cart included something just visible for a moment before it rounded the corner that was not standard cardiac or neurological emergency equipment. It was a portable neural mapping unit. Tricia had seen pictures of them in the chapter on intraoperative monitoring in the Advanced Principles book. Chapter 11, page 289. Neural mapping units were used in one specific class of emergency. The class of emergency involving conditions where the brain and the cardiac system were failing simultaneously. The class of emergency where standard monitoring equipment could not capture the full picture of what was happening, because the signal it was looking for was at the boundary between systems, in the interface between the nervous system and the cardiac muscle, in the deep tissue where the standard monitors did not reach. ventriculosynaptic collapse syndrome. Tricia knew this because she had read Chapter 12 of the Advanced Principles book 6 times and had written 7 pages of notes on the condition and its presentation and its treatment and its impossibly narrow window of surgical intervention. And Tricia knew that of the 7 surgeons in the world who could perform the procedure, only one was currently based in the continental United States, Dr. Chen Wei at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and that the other 6 were in Germany, Switzerland, Japan twice, South Korea, and Australia. And Tricia knew that the procedure required simultaneous access to the chest cavity and the base of the skull, and the reconnection of 3 specific neural pathways within a 40-minute window before cellular necrosis in the deep cardiac tissue past the point of reversibility. And Tricia knew, in the specific, devastating, deeply personal way that she knew things about medicine, that if the team she had just seen through the glass was managing a case of ventriculosynaptic collapse syndrome, and if none of those 7 surgeons were currently in Atlanta, Georgia, and if the neural mapping unit on the crash cart had been wheeled out because the standard monitors were showing what they always showed in advanced VCS, which was nothing, or as close to nothing as made no difference. Then the man in the VIP suite was in the 40-minute window right now, and the window was closing, and there was nobody in that building who could open it, nobody except possibly the 13-year-old girl standing in the lobby with her parents' hands on her shoulders steering her toward the exit. And Tricia stopped walking, and Diana said, "Baby." And Tricia said, "Mama, I need you to listen to me." And Marcus said, "Tricia, we are leaving." And Tricia turned and looked at both her parents with the specific expression that they had seen on their daughter's face 11 times in her 13 years of life. The expression that Marcus privately called the certainty face. The expression that meant Tricia had arrived at a conclusion through a process so complete and so methodical that the conclusion was not a belief, or a guess, or even a strong suspicion, but a fact that she had not yet found a way to communicate to the people around her, but needed to. And Marcus and Diana had learned through 11 encounters with the certainty face that dismissing it was not an option. Not because Tricia was always right, she was, in those 11 instances, always right, but because the face itself was evidence that something needed to be heard. And Marcus said, "Talk," and Tricia talked. Standing in the lobby of Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center 15 feet from the exit, between her parents, in a voice low enough not to carry to the reception desk, Tricia Cole explained what she had seen through the glass wall, what the neural mapping unit meant, what ventriculosynaptic collapse syndrome was, and what its presentation looked like, and what its treatment required, and what the 40-minute window meant in practical terms. And Marcus listened with the focused attention of a man who had learned that his daughter's technical explanations, even when he could not independently verify them, deserved to be fully received. And Diana listened with the focused attention of a mother who was watching her child's face and reading, behind the medical vocabulary and the technical precision, the thing that the vocabulary and precision were in service of, which was a 13-year-old girl who had spent 2 years with a discarded medical textbook, and had arrived at a moment where what she knew was the only thing standing between a man and his death. And when Tricia finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. And then Marcus said, "Tricia, what are you saying?" And Tricia said, "I am saying I know how to do the procedure." And Diana said, "Baby." And Tricia said, "Mama, I have read the procedure description 37 times. I have drawn the neural pathway diagrams from memory 14 times. I know which pathways, I know the sequence, I know the instruments, I know the 40-minute window, and I know what happens at minute 41. And Tricia said, "I know I am 13, and I know what you are thinking. And I know what that building full of doctors is thinking. But I am telling you that nobody in that building right now can do what I can do for that man, and the window is closing." And Marcus Cole looked at his daughter. And Marcus Cole looked at his wife. And Diana Cole looked at her husband. And Diana Cole looked at her daughter. And the lobby of Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center moved around them, white coats and visitor badges, and the soft hydraulic sigh of automatic doors. Indifferent to the specific weight of the conversation happening 15 feet from the exit between a sheet metal worker from Decatur and a former teacher's aide and their 13-year-old daughter who had read a discarded medical textbook 37 times. And Marcus said, "Even if everything you are saying is true, they will never let you." And Tricia said, "I know." And Diana said, "Then how?" And Tricia looked at the lobby, and Tricia looked at the glass wall of the VIP corridor, and Tricia said, "I need 5 minutes, and I need both of you to trust me." And Diana said, "Tricia." And Tricia said, "Mama, trust me." And Diana looked at her daughter's face, the certainty face. 11 times in 13 years, 11 times correct, and Diana said, 5 minutes. What Tricia did in those 5 minutes was the product of 12 seconds of observation on arrival, 2 years of medical reading, 13 years of problem solving, and a specific quality of spatial intelligence that her 6th grade science teacher had described as the ability to inhabit a building in her mind before her body has finished walking through it. Tricia told her parents to go back to the 5th floor waiting room. Not because she needed them out of the way, but because she needed them to have a legitimate reason to be in the building that did not involve their daughter, which meant that if something went wrong in the next 20 minutes, the hospital would have to process the Coles as a family with an outstanding medical appointment, rather than as a family that had come to the hospital with the intention of doing what Tricia was about to do. And then Tricia went to the bathroom on the main floor. Not the public bathroom near the lobby, the staff bathroom in the corridor behind the nursing station, accessible through a door that required a badge swipe, but that Tricia had observed was propped open with a doorstop at 8:17 a.m. when a nurse came through it on her way to the coffee station. And Tricia had verified, on the way back from the 5th floor examination room 40 minutes later, that the doorstop was still there. It was. And Tricia went through the propped door and down the staff corridor and into the staff bathroom. And in the staff bathroom, on a hook beside the supply cabinet, which was standard hospital layout, the supply cabinet in the staff bathroom for quick scrub-up access. Described in the floor plan convention section of the medical facility management chapter she had read in the administrative medicine textbook she had found at the library 14 months ago, were 3 sets of folded surgical scrubs, green, small, medium, and large, and Tricia took the small set, and Tricia changed into them in the bathroom stall, and Tricia looked at herself in the mirror. The scrubs were slightly too large. The pants required rolling at the ankle, the top required pushing up at the sleeves, but they were green and they had the right institutional look. And a 13-year-old in surgical scrubs in a hospital corridor, moving with the specific purposeful steadiness that Tricia had spent 3 minutes calibrating in the bathroom mirror, would read, in the peripheral vision of busy medical staff, as young, possibly a medical student, possibly a volunteer, possibly an intern. Not as a 13-year-old girl from the west side of Atlanta, whose mother had been sent to the wrong floor by a receptionist and dismissed by a chief of neurology in under 12 minutes. Tricia put her own clothes in the small backpack she was carrying, the backpack that also contained Gray's Anatomy, which she left in the backpack but did not take out, and her notebook, and 2 pens. And Tricia looked at herself in the mirror one more time. And Tricia said quietly to her own reflection, 40 minutes, and Tricia walked out of the staff bathroom. The supply room on the 3rd floor was adjacent to the main surgical suite and was accessible, according to the hospital floor plan posted in the administrative area on the 2nd floor. A public document, posted as per state transparency regulations, which Tricia had read in full in the 4 minutes they waited at the 2nd floor registration desk, while Helen determined that their problem was not her problem. Through a door that required a badge swipe, but that the supply room logistics meant was frequently propped open during shift change, which occurred at 10 a.m. And it was 10:26, and the door was open, and Tricia went in. The surgical instrument supply room at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center was organized with the specific, obsessive precision of a space where disorganization has consequences measured in human lives. Instruments were categorized by procedure type, sterilized and sealed in labeled packs, stored in drawers and on shelves with laminated index cards indicating contents and sterilization dates. And Tricia moved through this room with the focused, selective attention of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and where it should be because they have read the chapter on surgical instrument sets and their organization in the Advanced Principles textbook twice. Tricia needed the following: a thoracic retractor set, a cranial access kit, a neural pathway reconnection instrument set, which in standard hospital inventory was cataloged under the broader category of deep tissue neurosurgical instruments, and would be in the specialty procedures drawer, a set of microsurgical forceps, and a portable neural signal monitor. The thoracic retractor set was in drawer 7. The cranial access kit was on shelf 3 behind the orthopedic instrument sets. The deep tissue neurosurgical instruments were in the specialty procedures drawer, 4th drawer from the bottom on the right wall, laminated card reading specialty NEURO, authorized personnel. And the portable neural signal monitor was on the equipment shelf at the back of the room, beside the portable ultrasound unit. Tricia took what she needed. And Tricia placed everything in the gray surgical instrument tray that she pulled from the clean tray stacked beside the door. And Tricia covered the tray with a sterile drape from the drape shelf. And Tricia picked up the tray with both hands and walked out of the supply room, and nobody stopped her. Because a child in surgical scrubs carrying a draped instrument tray in a hospital corridor moves through that corridor in the specific visual grammar of institutional competence. The tray says purpose, the scrubs say authority, the unhurried steadiness of the carrier says this is routine. And the 2 nurses who passed Tricia in the corridor between the supply room and the elevator looked at her the way busy people in busy buildings look at other busy people in that building, which is to say they did not look at her at all. Tricia took the elevator to the 7th floor. The VIP suites were on the 7th floor. She knew this because the hospital directory, mounted on the wall beside every elevator on every floor, listed departments by floor in alphabetical order by category, and VIP patient services, private suites was listed as floor 7. And the elevator opened on the 7th floor to a corridor that was immediately, unmistakably different from the floors below. The carpet was thicker. The lighting was warmer. The nursing station was staffed by 2 nurses in a uniform that was subtly distinct from the standard floor nurses, a different color trim on the collar, a different quality of fabric, and behind the station the corridor continued to a set of double doors marked private suites, and in a chair against the wall outside those double doors sat the silver-haired woman Tricia had seen through the glass lobby wall. Small, 60 or so, hands in her lap, fingers intertwined so tightly the knuckles were white. Eyes forward, seeing nothing. The destroyed face, still destroyed, still past the ordinary expressions of grief, still in the specific exposure of someone who has had something catastrophic happen to them 30 minutes ago and has not yet found the shape of how to carry it. And beside the silver-haired woman stood a nurse, a different nurse from the station, younger, hand resting gently on the woman's shoulder. And the nurse was saying something in a low voice. And the silver-haired woman was nodding without hearing it, and at the double doors 2 security guards were positioned. And down the corridor, visible through the small reinforced glass window in the double doors, a medical team was visible, white coats, the crash cart, the neural mapping unit, in the controlled, quiet, methodical activity of people who have moved from emergency response into something else. Something that looked, from the corridor, like the specific organized stillness of medical professionals managing a situation they cannot reverse. The stillness of people waiting for a time to pass. The stillness of people who are present because protocol requires presence but whose presence is no longer directed toward an outcome. The stillness of a room that has given up. And Tricia stood at the elevator for a moment and looked at all of this. And Tricia looked at the double doors. And Tricia looked at the 2 security guards. And Tricia looked at the silver-haired woman in the chair. And Tricia made a calculation, not emotional, not impulsive, the specific rapid-fire calculation of a mind that had been running scenarios since the lobby, and walked toward the silver-haired woman. and Tricia stood in front of the woman, and the woman looked up, and Tricia said, "My name is Tricia Cole. I am 13 years old, and I know what is wrong with your husband. And I know how to fix it, and I need you to get me through those doors." And Alina Whitmore looked at this child, dark-skinned, 13, in surgical scrubs slightly too large for her, a draped instrument tray in her hands, standing in the corridor of the VIP suite level of Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center with an expression of absolute certainty on her face. And Alina Whitmore said nothing for a long moment. And then Alina said, "How do you know it is my husband?" And Tricia said, "Because of the way you are sitting, and because of the neural mapping unit on the crash cart, and because the team behind those doors has stopped moving urgently, and a woman does not sit the way you are sitting for a colleague or a friend. She sits that way for the person she cannot imagine the world without." And Alina Whitmore looked at Tricia Cole for a long moment, and Alina's eyes moved to the instrument tray in Tricia's hands. And Alina said, "You are 13 years old." And Tricia said, "Yes, ma'am." And Alina said, "What do you know about what is happening to my husband?" And Tricia said, "He has ventriculosynaptic collapse syndrome. The standard monitors are showing flat or near flat because they cannot detect the residual signal in the deep cardiac tissue, but the signal is there. And the 40-minute window for neural pathway reconnection has not closed yet, but it is closing right now. Every minute we are standing here, it is closing." And Alina Whitmore stood up from the chair, and Alina looked at the double doors, and Alina looked at Tricia, and Alina said, "If you are wrong," and Tricia said, "He is already dead by every measure those doctors are using. I'm not offering you a risk. I'm offering you the only chance that exists right now in this building, in this city. The 7 surgeons who can do this procedure are in Baltimore, Germany, Switzerland, Japan twice, South Korea, and Australia. None of them are here. I am here." And Alina Whitmore looked at the security guards at the double doors, and Alina walked toward them. The next 4 minutes were the loudest 4 minutes the 7th floor of Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center had ever experienced. And the loudest voice in those 4 minutes was not Alina Whitmore, who spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 35 years beside a powerful man and had absorbed from him the understanding that volume is what you use when authority is not enough. And the loudest voice was not Tricia Cole, who said very little during those 4 minutes because Tricia was using those 4 minutes to move toward the door and stay moving toward the door regardless of what was happening around her. The loudest voice belonged to Nurse Patricia Greer, who had been summoned from the 5th floor by the 7th floor nursing station when Alina Whitmore told the security guards to let the child through, and who arrived on the 7th floor at a run and inserted herself between Tricia and the double doors with the energy of someone who had been looking for a reason to exercise authority since 8:30 a.m. and had found it. And Nurse Greer said, "Absolutely not. This child is not a medical professional. She is not authorized to be on this floor. She is not authorized to be in this hospital in surgical scrubs. She is not authorized to touch any patient in this facility. And I am calling security right now, and I am calling Dr. Holt, and I want to know how this child obtained those instruments because that is a theft issue and possibly a criminal matter." And Alina Whitmore said, "She is my guest." And Nurse Greer said, "Ma'am, with respect, you cannot authorize a child to perform surgery on your husband. That is not within your authority, and it is not within anyone's authority in this building to allow this to happen." And Alina said, "My husband has been pronounced dead." And Nurse Greer said, "I understand this is an incredibly difficult," and Alina said, "He has been pronounced dead and the doctors behind those doors have stopped working. So tell me, Nurse Greer, whose authority are we protecting right now?" And Nurse Greer opened her mouth, and Nurse Greer closed it, and Nurse Greer said, "I am calling Dr. Holt." And while Nurse Greer called Dr. Holt, Alina Whitmore put her hand on Tricia's back and walked her toward the double doors. And the security guards, both of whom had heard the exchange and both of whom were looking at Alina Whitmore with the specific expression of people who have been given a direct instruction by someone whose authority in this situation they cannot clearly define but whose grief they can clearly see, stepped back from the doors. Not all the way, just enough. And Tricia, moving through the gap between the guards, said to Alina quietly, "I need the room clear." everyone out. And Atlanta said, I understand. And Atlanta pushed the double doors open. The suite was large. A private patient suite at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center was not a standard hospital room. It was a room designed to approximate, in its dimensions and its appointments, the experience of a luxury hotel while providing the full capability of an intensive care unit. And in the center of the room, on the bed, connected to the full array of monitoring equipment, lay Harrison Whitmore, 61 years old, 6 feet tall. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the physical architecture of a man who had spent his adult life projecting power and whose body had organized itself around that projection. And Harrison Whitmore was completely still, and the monitors beside the bed showed the flat, near-featureless lines of a body from which standard medicine could detect no meaningful activity. There were 4 people in the room, 2 doctors, neither of them Dr. Holt, and 2 nurses. And all 4 of them looked up when Atlanta pushed through the doors. And one of the doctors, a man in his 40s named Dr. Preston, whose name Tricia read from his coat badge in the first second, said, Mrs. Whitmore, you cannot be in here right now. And Atlanta said, I want everyone out of this room. And Dr. Preston said, Mrs. Whitmore, and Atlanta said, and her voice had acquired in those 4 minutes something that had not been in it in the lobby, something that had been underneath the destroyed grief all along and was now coming to the surface. Something that was made of 35 years of loving a man and was not going to be stopped by anything that Dr. Preston had to say. Everyone out. Now. And the 4 medical personnel looked at each other, and they looked at Atlanta. And they looked at Tricia, standing beside Atlanta in slightly too large surgical scrubs holding a draped instrument tray. And Dr. Preston said, Who is this? And Atlanta said, She is the only person in this building who knows how to help my husband. And Dr. Preston said, She is a child. And Atlanta said, You have declared him dead. You have stopped working. You have nothing left to lose by letting her try and everything to lose by stopping her. Now get out of my husband's room. And Dr. Preston looked at his colleague, and his colleague shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible shrug of a person who has decided that the responsibility for what happens next is not theirs to carry. And Dr. Preston walked to the door, and the 2 nurses followed him, and the second doctor, after a moment's hesitation, followed. And Atlanta followed them to the door and said to the room, I am going to need 10 minutes. Please give us that. And Dr. Preston said, I am calling Dr. Holt. And Atlanta said, Yes, call him. And Atlanta closed the door, and Atlanta Whitmore slid the lock on the suite door. And Atlanta turned to look at Tricia Cole, and Atlanta said, It is yours. And Tricia set the draped instrument tray on the supply counter beside the bed and pulled the drape away. And Tricia looked at the instruments: thoracic retractor set, cranial access kit, deep tissue neurosurgical instruments, microsurgical forceps, portable neural signal monitor. And Tricia looked at Harrison Whitmore on the bed. And Tricia looked at the neural mapping unit on the crash cart beside the bed, which was still powered on and which was showing, on its display screen, something that the doctors who had left the room had been reading as noise. The specific low-frequency visual static of a monitor receiving no meaningful signal. But Tricia had read, in Chapter 12 of the Advanced Principles book, that what standard medical personnel read as noise on a neural mapping unit in a VCS case was not noise. It was signal, attenuated, degraded, barely there, but signal. The residual electrical activity in the deep cardiac tissue, the last ember of the fire that was Harrison Whitmore's life, burning at a frequency that was below the threshold of the equipment's default sensitivity settings, but that could be confirmed by adjusting the frequency range on the monitor to the low signal detection band. Tricia reached over to the neural mapping unit and adjusted the frequency range. And the static on the screen resolved not into a clear, strong waveform but into something. A low, irregular pattern, faint but present, and Tricia looked at the pattern, and Tricia said to Atlanta, He is alive, the signal is there. And Tricia looked at the clock on the wall of the suite, 10:48 a.m., and Tricia calculated backward from what she knew about VCS progression, and Tricia said, I have approximately 23 minutes. And Tricia put on the surgical gloves from the instrument tray, and Tricia positioned the thoracic retractor set. And Tricia looked at Harrison Whitmore one more time at his face, which was the face of a man she did not know, a billionaire, a builder of skylines, a powerful man who had spent his life in rooms very different from the rooms Tricia Cole was accustomed to, and Tricia said quietly, "I am going to bring you back." And Tricia began. Outside the door of Suite 714, the 7th floor of Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center became, over the next several minutes, the most populated it had been since the hospital's opening in 2009, and the population arrived in waves. The first wave was Dr. Preston and his colleague, and the 2 nurses who had been in the room when a leaner cleared it, now standing in the corridor with the specific disoriented energy of medical professionals who have been removed from a patient's room by the patient's wife and replaced by a child. And Dr. Preston was on his phone. The second wave was Dr. Raymond Holt, who arrived from the 5th floor at a pace that was as close to running as a man of his professional dignity was prepared to go, his white coat open, his expression the expression of someone who has received information that he has determined is impossible and is moving toward the source of that information to confirm the impossibility. And Dr. Holt reached the double doors of the VIP suite corridor and said, "Where is she?" And Dr. Preston said, "In 714. Mrs. Whitmore let her in and locked the door. And Dr. Holt said, "She what?" And Dr. Preston said, "She let her in and locked the door." And Dr. Holt said, "Call security, call the police, get that door open." The third wave was security. Officer Dale Briggs, 52 years old, lead security officer for the 7th floor VIP section, a large man with 20 years of institutional experience, and the specific quality of practiced authority that meant he had handled difficult situations in this building before, and had handled them by being the largest and loudest presence in the immediate vicinity until the difficult situation resolved. And Officer Briggs arrived at the door of Suite 714 and knocked twice. The official "this is not request" knock of institutional authority and said, "Security, open the door," and the door did not open. And Officer Briggs knocked again harder and said, "This is security. Open this door immediately or we will open it ourselves." And the door did not open, and behind Officer Briggs the corridor was filling. The 2 nurses from the original team, Dr. Preston and his colleague, Dr. Holt, 2 additional nurses from the 7th floor station, and now having come up from the main floor at a speed that made clear she had taken the stairs, Nurse Patricia Greer. And Nurse Greer shouldered through to the front of the corridor group and planted herself beside Officer Briggs and said, "Break it down." And Officer Briggs looked at her, and Officer Briggs said, "I need Dr. Holt's authorization." And Dr. Holt said, "You have it. Open the door." And Officer Briggs took a step back and prepared to apply the specific technique used for locked hospital suite doors, which was a shoulder strike to the door at the lock plate rather than a kick, because hospital suite doors were solid, and a kick to the center was ineffective, and the maintenance costs for replacing kicked-out door panels were a recurring item on the building management budget that Officer Briggs had been lectured about at the last security training review. But before Officer Briggs applied the shoulder strike, Eleanor Whitmore's voice came through the door, and Eleanor said, "Stop." And the voice was quiet, but it carried through the door with the specific penetrating quality of a voice that is accustomed to being heard through obstruction. And the corridor went marginally quieter. And Eleanor said, "If you break down this door, you will disrupt a surgical procedure currently being performed on my husband, and any disruption of that procedure at this stage will kill him. He is already dead by your determination. The only thing that stands between him and that determination being permanent is what is happening in this room right now." And Eleanor said, "I am asking you, I am begging you to give her 10 more minutes." And the corridor was quiet for a moment. And Dr. Holt said, "Mrs. Whitmore, the person in that room with your husband is a 13-year-old girl who has no medical qualifications of any kind. Whatever she is doing to your husband is not a surgical procedure. It is at best a dangerous delusion, and at worst a criminal act. And I am telling you as the chief of neurology of this hospital that you need to open this door right now." And Atlanta said, "My husband was declared dead at 10:42 a.m. You have no medical obligation to a deceased patient. You have no authority over what I choose to do in the room where my dead husband is lying. And you have no right to take from me the only possibility that still exists." And Dr. Holt said, "She is a child." And Atlanta said, "Yes." And Atlanta said, "And she is the only one in this building who knew what was wrong with him. So what does that make the rest of you?" And the corridor was quiet again. And Officer Briggs looked at Dr. Holt. And Dr. Holt looked at the door. And Dr. Preston looked at the floor. And Nurse Greer said, "This is insane. This is completely insane." And Dr. Holt said, "We are opening that door," and raised his hand to authorize Officer Briggs. And that was when the elevator opened. And that was when Dr. Amara Osai stepped out. Dr. Amara Osai was 34 years old and had been a junior physician in the internal medicine department at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center for 11 months. And Amara Osai had grown up in Accra, Ghana, the daughter of a community health worker and a secondary school science teacher, and had come to the United States on a full scholarship to Howard University, and had graduated top of her medical school class at Emory, and had matched at Atlanta Pinnacle through a combination of exceptional credentials and the specific persistence of someone who understood that exceptional credentials from a historically black university did not open doors at places like Atlanta Pinnacle with the automatic ease that the same credentials from a different institution would. And Amara Osai had spent 11 months at Atlanta Pinnacle being competent, and being underutilized, and being spoken over in rounds, and being assigned the cases that her colleagues found least prestigious and finding ways to do excellent work in those cases anyway, because excellent work was not something Amara Osai was capable of not doing regardless of the audience. And Amara had been on the main floor at 10:30 when she heard, from a nurse she trusted, that something extraordinary was happening on the 7th floor. And Amara had taken the elevator up. And Amara stepped out of the elevator and looked at the corridor scene: Dr. Holt, Nurse Greer, Officer Briggs, the assembled medical personnel, the locked door of Suite 714, and said, "What is happening?" And Dr. Holt said, "A child has locked herself in a patient suite and is claiming to perform surgery. We are about to open the door." And Amara said, "What child?" And Dr. Preston said, "A girl, 13, black, came up from the main floor somehow in scrubs. She had a full instrument tray." And Amara went very still. And Amara said, "What is the patient's diagnosis?" And Dr. Preston said, "Ventriculosynaptic collapse syndrome, declared at 10:42. And Amara said, "And the girl, what did she say?" And Dr. Preston said, "She said she knew how to do the reconnection procedure. She said she had 23 minutes on the window." And Amara said, "How long ago was that?" And Dr. Preston looked at his watch. And Dr. Preston said, "Approximately 12 minutes. And Amara Osai looked at the locked door of Suite 714. And Dr. Preston said, "Approximately 12 minutes. And Amara Osai looked at the locked door of Suite 714. And Amara looked at Dr. Holt. And Amara said, "Do not open that door." And Dr. Holt said, "Excuse me." And Amara said, "If she is performing the neural pathway reconnection procedure and she is 11 minutes in, opening that door right now will kill Harrison Whitmore with absolute certainty. Because the reconnection requires uninterrupted access to both the thoracic cavity and the cranial base simultaneously, and any movement or shock to the patient during that process will sever the pathways before they are reconnected. You will kill him with your own hand, right now. Is that what you want?" And Dr. Holt looked at Amara Osai, this 34-year-old junior physician who had spent 11 months being competent and being spoken over, and Dr. Holt said, "You cannot be serious." And Amara said, "I am completely serious." And Amara said, "I have studied ventriculosynaptic collapse syndrome for 3 years. I know the procedure. I cannot perform it. Nobody in this building can perform it, but I know exactly what it requires, and I know that opening that door right now is the last thing we should do." And Amara said, "Give her the time," and the corridor was silent, and Officer Briggs lowered his hand, and Nurse Greer said, "This is insane." This is the most insane thing I have ever witnessed in 22 years of nursing, and I want it on record. And Dr. Holt said, Patricia, and Nurse Greer said, that I objected, formally, completely, I objected. And Dr. Holt looked at the door, and Dr. Holt looked at Amara, and Dr. Holt looked at the door again. And Dr. Holt said quietly in the voice of a man who has just had something shift beneath him that he has not yet fully processed, how long? And Amara said, give her until 11:15, and Dr. Holt said, and if nothing has changed at 11:15, and Amara said, then we open the door, and Dr. Holt said, fine. And Dr. Holt looked at Officer Briggs, and Officer Briggs stepped back from the door, and the corridor waited. Inside Suite 714, Tricia Cole was working. And working is the word, not the word that would appear in the medical literature that was eventually written about this day, not the word that the journalists who covered the story would use, not the word that the professors at Emory and Johns Hopkins and Stanford who studied the case would put in their papers. Those words would be extraordinary and unprecedented and inexplicable. But inside the room, in the moment, the word was working. Because what Tricia was doing was what she had always done, applying everything she knew to the problem in front of her, with the full and complete and uninterrupted attention that she brought to every problem, and proceeding methodically through the sequence that needed to happen in the time that was available for it to happen in. The thoracic access had taken 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Tricia had made the incision along the standard thoracotomy line described on page 318 of the Advanced Principles book, lateral, between the 5th and 6th ribs, providing the specific access angle to the deep cardiac tissue that the neural pathway reconnection required without causing the secondary tissue damage that a more direct approach would produce. And the retractor set had opened the cavity to the required width. And Tricia had located the deep cardiac tissue, exactly where the anatomical diagram on page 321 showed it would be, with the specific visual characteristic of early-stage VCS that the book described as the pale, mottled appearance of tissue in hypoxic distress that had not yet crossed the cellular necrosis threshold. Pale and mottled, not black, not gray. The specific pale, mottled appearance that meant the threshold had not been crossed. The ember was still there. The cranial access had taken 4 minutes and 12 seconds because the cranial access kit at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center had a drill guide that was a slightly different model than the one described in the book. The book described the Cranston model VII, and the kit in the supply room contained the Cranston model IX, which had an additional safety lock that Tricia had not encountered before and had needed to take 15 seconds to examine and understand before proceeding. 15 seconds she had calculated she could afford. She had proceeded, and the cranial access was complete, and the base of the skull provided the approach to the third cervical neural trunk that the procedure required. And now Tricia was at the most critical stage, the neural pathway reconnection itself. 3 pathways, in sequence. The sequence was specified on page 329 with the precision that the author of the Advanced Principles book, a surgeon named Dr. Elizabeth Huang, who had performed the procedure twice in her career, both times successfully, applied to every technical description in the book, which was the precision of someone writing for a reader who might actually need to do this someday and must therefore have every detail correct. Pathway 1. The ventriculosynaptic primary tract, located at the 4 o'clock position relative to the cranial access point, identifiable by its distinctive blue-white coloration compared to the surrounding neural tissue. Pathway 2. The cardiac neural bridge, located in the deep cardiac tissue accessed through the thoracotomy, identifiable by its position at the base of the right ventricle wall. Pathway 3. The connective relay, the most difficult of the 3, located at the junction between the primary tract and the cardiac bridge, accessible through both access points simultaneously, requiring the surgeon to maintain contact with both pathways while completing the reconnection, which was the specific reason the procedure required 2 surgeons, or, as the book noted in a dry parenthetical that Tricia had read 7 times. A single surgeon of exceptional spatial dexterity and upper extremity independence. Tricia had been testing her spatial dexterity and upper extremity independence since she was 9 years old, using the exercises described in the motor skills development chapter of the pediatric occupational therapy textbook she had read at the library. Both hands, independent, precise. She had practiced the specific hand position required for the connective relay reconnection in her bedroom, using the anatomical model she had built from the Gray's Anatomy diagrams and a set of clay she had shaped into the approximate dimensions and textures of the relevant tissue. 14 times, not because she had known she would need it, because it was there to be practiced, and she practiced everything. Pathway 1 reconnected at 11:03 a.m. The portable neural signal monitor showed a change, small, incremental, the specific pattern shift that page 331 described as the first confirmation of successful primary tract reconnection. A slight increase in signal amplitude, still faint, but measurably different from the pre-reconnection baseline. Tricia moved to pathway 2, the cardiac neural bridge. The microsurgical forceps were required here. The pathway was surrounded by the fragile deep cardiac tissue, and the margin for error was measured in fractions of a millimeter. And Tricia worked the forceps with both hands in the specific coordinated independence that the exercise program had developed, left hand maintaining position on the thoracic axis, right hand advancing the forceps with the precise movement that the book described as a forward rotation of 45 degrees at the wrist, while maintaining a fixed distal position. And Alina Whitmore stood against the wall of Suite 714 and watched. And Alina had said nothing since she locked the door. And Alina had not moved from her position against the wall. And Alina was watching her husband's face, not the instruments, not the monitor, not the access points, her husband's face. And Alina's hands were at her sides. And Alina's fingers were open, no longer intertwined in the tight-knuckled grip she had maintained in the corridor chair. Open, like someone who has placed something in another person's hands and is letting go. Pathway 2 reconnected at 11:09 a.m. And the neural signal monitor showed another change, larger this time, the signal amplitude increasing to a level that was, according to the classification table on page 333, in the range characterized as weak but present. Still not the level of a functioning ventriculosynaptic connection, but the direction of change was correct. The direction of change was toward life, and Tricia reached the connective relay. This was the part that the book described across 11 pages. 11 pages for a procedure element that would take Tricia approximately 4 minutes, because the 11 pages were not just technical instruction. They were the accumulated wisdom of the 2 times Dr. Elizabeth Huang had done this, the specific things she had learned in the operating room that could not be derived from anatomy alone. The way the relay tissue moved slightly, in response to the increasing cardiac signal, a micro-movement that had surprised Dr. Huang the first time and that she had noted carefully so that the second time she was prepared for it. The specific resistance of the connective tissue at the 3/8 rotation point that required maintained pressure rather than increased force. The instinct was to push harder, Dr. Huang wrote, but harder was wrong. Maintained steady pressure over 6 to 8 seconds was right. And the moment of reconnection itself, which was not a felt sensation in the conventional surgical sense, but a visual confirmation on the neural signal monitor, a specific pattern that Dr. Huang described as the signal suddenly becoming coherent rather than simply stronger. Tricia had read these 11 pages with the specific comprehensive attention she reserved for the most important material. And the micro-movement happened at 47 seconds into the connective relay approach, exactly as described. And Tricia held her position and did not respond to the movement with additional force. And the resistance at 3/8 rotation arrived at 2 minutes and 12 seconds. And Tricia maintained steady pressure. And Tricia counted to 6. And at 6 seconds the resistance resolved and the relay tissue accepted the reconnection position. and Tricia looked at the neural signal monitor. And the monitor showed coherent signal, not strong, not the level of a fully recovered VCS patient, which would take weeks of treatment and rehabilitation, but coherent, organized. The ventriculosynaptic connection re-established at a level sufficient to allow the cardiac muscle to resume autonomous function, and Tricia looked at the cardiac monitor, and the cardiac monitor showed nothing, because Harrison Whitmore's heart had not yet received the signal. The connection was made, but the signal had not propagated yet, and Tricia knew this because page 344 said, following successful reconnection confirmation on the neural signal monitor, expect a propagation delay of between 8 and 35 minutes before cardiac resumption of autonomous function. Do not intervene. Do not apply external cardiac stimulation. Wait. And Tricia closed the thoracic access, and Tricia closed the cranial access, and Tricia sutured. And Tricia worked with the same methodical precision she had brought to every step, and the suturing took 6 minutes, and when it was done, Tricia stepped back from the bed and removed her gloves. And Tricia looked at the clock on the wall of the suite, 11:14 a.m., 26 minutes since she had begun. And Atlanta Whitmore said from the wall, "Is it done?" And Tricia said, "The procedure is complete. The reconnection was successful." But Atlanta said, "He is not," and Tricia said, "No. Not yet. There will be a delay between 8 and 35 minutes. The signal needs to propagate through the tissue." And Tricia said, "And then his heart will start." And Atlanta looked at her husband's face. And Atlanta looked at Tricia. And Atlanta said, "How do you know?" And Tricia said, "Because I have read the only account ever written by someone who has done this successfully. And the account says the heart starts." And Tricia said, "But we should let them in now, in case there are complications when it starts, in case he needs immediate support." And Atlanta walked to the door, and Atlanta unlocked it. The door of suite 714 opened inward, and Atlanta Whitmore pulled it open and stood in the doorway. And the corridor was fuller than it had been when the door closed, because in the 17 minutes since Officer Briggs had stepped back from the door, the population of the 7th floor VIP corridor had grown significantly. Dr. Holt and Nurse Greer and Officer Briggs and Dr. Preston and the assembled nurses, and the 2 additional security guards who had arrived at some point, were joined now by the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Margaret Calloway, who had been called from a board meeting on the 4th floor, and who had arrived to find a situation that defied every category of incident management she had trained for. And beside Dr. Calloway stood her assistant. And in the back of the corridor group, partially visible between the people in front of them, stood Marcus and Diana Cole, who had been found by a young nurse named Destiny, who had remembered the family from the 5th floor and who had thought, when she heard what was happening on the 7th floor, that they deserved to know. And Marcus Cole's face when Atlanta opened the door and the corridor saw the inside of suite 714, the open suite, the covered instrument tray on the counter, the sutured patient on the bed, the neural signal monitor showing its coherent low signal, and Tricia standing beside the bed in slightly too large surgical scrubs with her surgical gloves removed and her hands at her sides. Marcus Cole's face did the thing that faces do when they are trying to process too many things at once. Pride and terror and love, and the specific parental emotion that has no name, but that is the feeling of recognizing in your child something that is larger than anything you prepared them for and being simultaneously overwhelmed by it, and certain that it was always there. And Diana Cole's hand went to her mouth, and Nurse Greer said, "Is he alive?" Because despite everything, despite the 22 years of professional certainty and the institutional indignation and the objection formally and completely on the record, Nurse Greer was a nurse. And the nurse part asked the question, and Tricia said, "Not yet, but he will be. We need to wait." And Dr. Holt walked into the room, and Dr. Holt looked at Harrison Whitmore, and Dr. Holt looked at the neural signal monitor, and Dr. Holt said, "What am I looking at?" And Amara Osei, who had followed Dr. Holt in, said, "Coherent ventriculosynaptic signal post-reconnection. That is what you are looking at." And Dr. Holt looked at Amara, and Dr. Holt looked at the monitor, and Dr. Holt said, "That is not possible." And Amara said, "And yet," and Dr. Holt looked at Tricia, and Dr. Holt said, "You are 13 years old." And Tricia said, "Yes, sir." And Dr. Holt said, "How?" And Tricia said, "Chapter 12. Advanced Principles of Cardiovascular and Neurological Surgery, 3rd edition. I found it in a dumpster behind Morehouse School of Medicine when I was 11. I read it 4 times, and the chapter on ventricular-synaptic collapse syndrome 37 times, and Dr. Holt said nothing. And Dr. Holt looked at the monitor again. And Dr. Calloway, the chief of staff, entered the room and looked at the scene and said, "Someone needs to explain to me exactly what has happened in this room." And Amara Ose turned to Dr. Calloway and began explaining. And while Amara explained, the room arranged itself, medical personnel positioning around the bed, monitoring equipment being checked and adjusted, the specific organized preparation of a medical team that has arrived after the critical moment, but understands that the critical moment's consequences still need managing. And through all of this, Harrison Whitmore lay still, and the cardiac monitor showed nothing, and the neural signal monitor showed coherent signal. And the clock on the wall showed 11:23 a.m., 12 minutes since Tricia had stepped back from the bed, and Tricia stood near the wall where Eleanor had stood during the procedure. And Marcus and Diana had been allowed into the room by nobody in particular, simply by the general confusion of authority, in a situation that nobody's authority had been designed for. And Marcus had his arm around Tricia, and Diana had her hand on Tricia's face, and was looking at her daughter the way you look at someone you love who has just done something that the world was not expecting from them, and that the world is still catching up to. And Tricia leaned into her mother's hand. And for a moment she was not the girl who had read the book 37 times and done the procedure that 7 surgeons in the world could do. She was 13, and her mother's hand was warm, and she leaned into it, and the cardiac monitor alarmed, not the flat alarm of a monitor detecting nothing, the specific 2-tone alert of a monitor detecting something new, something that had not been there before. And every person in that room looked at the cardiac monitor simultaneously. And the line on the cardiac monitor moved, not strongly, not with the full amplitude of a healthy heartbeat, weakly, tentatively, the specific fragile movement of a cardiac muscle receiving a signal it had been separated from and is beginning slowly, carefully, with the caution of something that has been to the edge and is coming back from it to respond to. 1 beat, then nothing for 4 seconds, then another beat, then nothing for 3 seconds, then 2 beats in 5 seconds, then 3, then 5. And the rhythm was irregular and the amplitude was low, and it was not anything close to a normal sinus rhythm, and it was the most beautiful thing that every person in that room had seen in their professional career, or in Eleanor Whitmore's case, in her life. And Eleanor Whitmore walked to her husband's bedside and took his hand, and the cardiac monitor kept moving, irregular but present, weak but strengthening. The signal propagating through tissue that had been separated from its source and was reconnecting, fiber by fiber and cell by cell, with the life that a 13-year-old girl had put back into it. And Dr. Holt stood beside the monitor and watched. And Dr. Holt's face was the face of a man who has spent 30 years being the most knowledgeable person in every room he enters, and has just encountered, for the first time, the specific and profound experience of being unambiguously wrong about what was possible. And the face was not comfortable, but it was honest. And Dr. Holt said, quietly, to nobody in particular, in the voice of a man who is saying something he knows will be the most important thing he says today, "Someone get this girl a chair." And Nurse Greer, and this was the detail that Amara Osai would remember and recount in every version of the story she ever told, Nurse Greer went and got the chair. Harrison Whitmore regained consciousness at 2:17 p.m. And his first words, in a voice that was rough and thin and carried the specific quality of a voice finding itself after a long absence, were directed at Eleanor, whose hand had not left his for the 3 hours between the cardiac monitor's first beat and the moment his eyes opened. And Harrison said, "Ellie." And Eleanor said, "I am here." And Harrison said, "What happened?" And Eleanor looked at him for a moment. And Eleanor said, "Someone brought you back." And Harrison said, "Who?" And Eleanor looked across the room to where Tricia Cole was sitting in the chair that Nurse Greer had brought, the chair that was too big for her, the way everything in the building had been slightly too big, the scrubs, the instruments, the room itself, sitting with her feet not quite touching the floor and her Gray's Anatomy open in her lap in the specific unconscious reflex of a girl whose default response to any period of unstructured time is to read. And Alina said, "That girl over there." And Harrison turned his head slowly, carefully toward Tricia, and Tricia looked up from her book, and Harrison Whitmore looked at Tricia Cole for a long moment, and Harrison said, "How old are you?" And Tricia said, "13, sir." And Harrison said, "What is your name?" And Tricia said, Tricia Cole." And Harrison was quiet for a moment, and then Harrison Whitmore smiled. And it was the smile of a man who has been to the place where everything ends and has been given something that cannot be named given back, and who is smiling at the specific undeserved and extraordinary gift of finding himself, against all rational expectation, still in the world. And Harrison said, "Thank you, Tricia Cole." And Tricia said, "You are welcome, sir." The afternoon was long and complicated and full of things that needed managing. Dr. Calloway convened an emergency board meeting at 3 p.m. to address the liability and regulatory questions raised by the morning's events, which were, from a legal and institutional standpoint, significant. A minor child had performed an unauthorized surgical procedure on a patient in a private suite, using instruments removed from the hospital's supply room without authorization. The procedure had involved opening the thoracic cavity and the cranial base of a living patient. These were not small things from an institutional standpoint regardless of the outcome, but the outcome was Harrison Whitmore sitting up in his bed at 4 p.m., speaking with Alina and with the cardiologist who had been called in for post-procedure monitoring, and eating carefully, slowly, the soup that Alina had asked the hospital kitchen to prepare. And the outcome was the neural signal monitor showing a coherent, strengthening ventriculosynaptic signal. And the outcome was the cardiac monitor showing a rhythm that was, by 4:30 p.m., recognizable as approaching normal. And the outcome was that the board meeting at 3 p.m. had lasted 11 minutes before Dr. Calloway adjourned it, because the conversation had reached a point that could not be navigated by institutional liability frameworks and required a different kind of consideration. Harrison Whitmore's personal attorney arrived at the hospital at 3:45 p.m. His name was Gerald Shaw, and he was 60 years old and had been Harrison's attorney for 22 years, and had handled situations of extraordinary complexity in those 22 years, and had never once handled anything like this. And Gerald Shaw went into Harrison's room and stayed for 40 minutes. And when Gerald Shaw came out, he went to find Tricia Cole. Marcus and Diana Cole were in the family waiting room on the 7th floor, a smaller room off the main corridor, with the same thick carpet and the same warm lighting of the VIP section, but with the additional quality of a room that had been used hard in the previous hours, the furniture slightly rearranged, the water station cups depleted, the box of tissues on the side table almost empty. And Tricia was in the waiting room with her parents, in the chair beside her mother, reading her Gray's Anatomy. And Marcus had his arm around Diana, and Diana's head was on Marcus's shoulder, and Diana was not asleep, her eyes were open, but she was resting in the specific way of someone whose body has been through something that required everything it had and is now taking the first available opportunity to stand down. And Gerald Shaw knocked on the waiting room door and came in and introduced himself. And Marcus stood up, and Gerald Shaw said, "Mr. Cole, I am Gerald Shaw, Mr. Whitmore's attorney. I have been speaking with Mr. Whitmore and with Mrs. Whitmore, and I would like to speak with you and your family, if you are willing, about the morning's events and about what Mr. Whitmore would like to do going forward." And Marcus looked at Gerald Shaw with the careful attention of a man who has learned to read the language of institutional representatives who arrive after extraordinary events, who has learned to distinguish between the representatives whose first concern is the institution and the representatives whose first concern is something else. And Marcus said, "Please sit down." And Gerald Shaw sat down, and Gerald Shaw said, "Mr. Whitmore is alive because of what your daughter did this morning. He has asked me to communicate to you that he understands that fully and intends to address it in every appropriate way. But before we discuss specifics, I want to ask, how is your family? Mrs. Cole, your appointment this morning with Dr. Holt. Was your medical situation addressed? And Marcus said, in the voice of a man choosing his words precisely because he has learned that precision is the armor that matters. No, it was not addressed. We were misdirected twice before we reached the appointment. The appointment was cut short, and the physician indicated a 2 to 3 week follow-up timeline that I do not believe reflects the urgency of my wife's symptoms. And Marcus said, my wife has been experiencing progressive neurological symptoms for 8 months. She has a referral. She has documentation. And she came to this hospital today, 45 minutes early, to address those symptoms. And she left several hours later without her symptoms being addressed. And Marcus said, that is the complete and accurate answer to your question. And Gerald Shaw wrote something on his notepad. And Gerald Shaw said, Mr. Cole, before I came to speak with you, I spoke with Dr. Calloway, the chief of staff, and I told her what Mr. Whitmore has requested with regard to Mrs. Cole's medical care, and Dr. Calloway has agreed. Diana Cole will be seen today this afternoon before your family leaves this building by the senior neurological specialist in this hospital, not Dr. Holt, the senior specialist, with full diagnostic workup, full imaging, and an expedited care plan, today. And Gerald Shaw said, and that is not charity and it is not a favor. It is what should have happened at 9 a.m. this morning. And it is happening now. And Diana Cole lifted her head from Marcus's shoulder. And Diana looked at Gerald Shaw. And Diana said, today. And Gerald Shaw said, today. And Diana said, thank. And Marcus laughed. And Diana laughed. And it was the first time either of them had laughed since getting on the number 14 bus at 7:15 that morning. And the laugh was the specific laugh of people who have been through something enormous and have arrived unexpectedly on the other side of it, and whose bodies have just remembered that laughter is a thing that happens. And Tricia said, what? And that made them laugh harder. And Tricia shook her head and went back to her book, but Tricia was smiling. And Tricia's smile was the smile of a 13-year-old girl who has spent her life being told, in the specific wordless ways that institutions and systems communicate their assessments, that she is not the kind of person that rooms like these are built for, and who has spent this particular Tuesday demonstrating, with complete and irrefutable precision, that she is exactly the kind of person that rooms like these need. 3 things happened on the day after Tricia Cole performed the neural pathway reconnection procedure on Harrison Whitmore in Suite 714 of Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center. And these 3 things arrived in a sequence that was not planned, but that was, in the way of sequences that unfold from a single moment of extraordinary consequence, inevitable. The first thing happened at 7 a.m. when the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published an article on its front page whose headline read, 13-year-old girl performs impossible surgery, AT Atlanta Pinnacle, billionaire Harrison WHITMORE alive. And the article was written by a journalist named Pamela Ose, who had received a tip the previous evening from a source inside the hospital, whose name was not published, but who spoke with the specific knowledgeable authority of someone who had been present for the events described. And the article was accurate, precise, detailed, careful, the work of a journalist who had verified every element through multiple sources before publication. And the article described the morning in full. The Cole family arriving at 8:15, the misdirection by reception, the dismissive appointment with Dr. Holt, the hostile management by Nurse Greer, and then what happened on the 7th floor, what Tricia had done, what Alina Whitmore had done, what Dr. Amara Osa had done, what the corridor of the 7th floor had looked like at 11:15 a.m., and what the cardiac monitor had shown at 11:23, and the article was read by 9 a.m. by 400,000 people in the greater Atlanta area. And by noon it had been read by 4 million people nationally. And by 3 p.m. it had been read, in full or in summary, by most of the English-speaking world. And by the following morning it had been translated into 23 languages. The second thing happened at 9 a.m. when Harrison Whitmore, sitting up in his hospital bed, with considerably more color in his face than the previous day, and a leaner beside him and Gerald Shaw in the chair across the room, called a press conference. Not a large one, the hospital's conference room, limited media access, a brief statement. And Harrison Whitmore said, in the specific direct language of a man who has built a real estate empire from nothing and has learned that clarity is more powerful than eloquence. Yesterday morning I died. The best medical team in Atlanta confirmed it. And a 13-year-old girl named Trisha Cole, whose family had come to this hospital for medical care and had been treated as though they were an inconvenience rather than patients, did what no one else in this building could do. She brought me back. And Harrison said, I have spent 35 years building things in this city. Buildings, projects, developments, things made of steel and glass and concrete that you can see from anywhere in the Atlanta skyline. But I have never built anything as important as what Trisha Cole did with her hands in that room yesterday. And Harrison said, and I intend to spend a significant portion of the rest of my life, which I have because of her, making sure the world knows that, and making sure she has everything she needs to do whatever she is going to do next. And Harrison Whitmore looked at the cameras. And Harrison said, the Cole family deserved better from this hospital yesterday. They deserve better from every institution in this city. And that is going to change. Starting today. Starting with me. The third thing happened at 10 a.m. in the senior neurological specialist's examination room on the 8th floor of Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center, where Diana Cole was undergoing the full diagnostic workup that Gerald Shaw had arranged the previous afternoon. And the specialist, Dr. Vera Kim, 51 years old, a neurologist who had trained at Duke and who was, in the private assessment of her colleagues, the most diagnostically precise physician on the hospital's staff, looked at Diana's imaging results and her symptom history and the specific pattern of reflex delay that Trisha had identified in the examination room 24 hours earlier and said, Mrs. Cole, I want to explain to you what I am seeing. And Diana said, please. And Dr. Kim said, the pattern of symptoms you are describing, the progressive headaches, the left-hand tremor, the specific reflex delay that your daughter apparently identified yesterday in the examination room, is consistent with cervical neural compression at the C6-C7 junction, which is treatable, which is, in fact, very treatable if addressed at this stage rather than allowed to progress. And Dr. Kim said, the reason it was not identified sooner is that the standard initial examination protocol for patients presenting with headache and tremor focuses on the brachial pathway rather than the cervical junction. It is a protocol gap. And Dr. Kim said, choosing her words carefully, your daughter identified the correct diagnostic target before I had the imaging, and Diana was quiet for a moment. And Diana said, what does treatment look like? And Dr. Kim said, for where you are right now, given what I am seeing, surgical intervention is not required. We are looking at a targeted steroid injection series to reduce the compression, followed by a specific physical therapy program for the cervical stabilization musculature, followed by monitoring at 3-month intervals. And Dr. Kim said, if you had not come in today, if this had been allowed to progress another 6 months at the rate your symptom history suggests it has been progressing, surgery would likely have been required and the outcome would have been significantly less certain. And Diana said, we came in yesterday. And Dr. Kim said, I know. And Dr. Kim said, I am sorry that you did not receive this yesterday. And Dr. Kim said, you are receiving it now. And Diana looked at her hands, the left hand, the one with the tremor, the one that Trisha had watched in the examination room and had known from everything she had read and studied, was telling a story that Dr. Raymond Holt had not bothered to hear. And Diana said, my daughter told me yesterday. She told me what it was, in the examination room. She said cervical C6 and C7. And Dr. Kim looked at Diana, and Dr. Kim said she was right. And Diana said, she usually is. And Diana Cole looked at the window of the examination room, the view from the 8th floor, the Atlanta skyline, the steel and glass buildings that Harrison Whitmore's company had built over 3 decades. And Diana thought about her daughter, about the dumpster behind Morehouse School of Medicine, about the 4 reads of the Advanced Principles book, about the 7 pages of margin notes in Chapter 12, about the certainty face, 11 times in 13 years, 11 times correct, about the girl who had arrived at this building 45 minutes early in Diana's best clothes and had been misdirected and dismissed, and had watched her mother receive inadequate care and had done the calculation and had gone to the staff bathroom and taken the scrubs, and had locked the door, and had brought a man back from the dead, and had gone back to reading her Gray's Anatomy, and Diana Cole smiled. It was the smile of a woman who has spent 13 years watching something grow inside her child, watching the hunger and the precision and the relentless attention, and has arrived at the morning after the day when the world discovered what she has always known. And the smile was tired, because Diana was tired, because the headache was still there, and the treatment had not yet begun, and the journey from the west side of Atlanta to this moment had been long and full of misdirections and dismissals. But the smile was there, and it was real, and Diana said to Dr. Kim, "When can we start?" In the weeks and months that followed the events of that Tuesday in October, the world did what the world does when it encounters something it cannot categorize. It argued about it. The medical community argued about the procedural ethics of an unauthorized surgery performed by a minor, and about the question of how a 13-year-old with no formal medical training had successfully performed a procedure that had a 92% fatality rate in the hands of expert surgeons, and about what the implications were for medical education, and for the assumptions that medical education made about who was capable of extraordinary things. The legal community argued about liability and authorization, and the complex question of what Alina Whitmore's authority over the decisions made in her husband's room extended to. The media argued about everything in the specific comprehensive way that media argues about things that contain within them too many different stories to be contained by any single narrative. But some things did not require argument. Some things simply happened. Harrison Whitmore established, within 30 days of leaving Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center, the Cole Foundation for Medical Education, funded with an initial endowment of $40 million, designed to provide full educational support for academically exceptional students from low-income backgrounds who demonstrated interest in medical sciences, with a specific focus on removing the financial and institutional barriers that had made Tricia Cole's path to that examination room on the 7th floor the specific obstacle course it had been. And the Foundation's first scholar, announced at a press conference in November at which Harrison Whitmore sat beside Tricia Cole and Tricia was wearing her own clothes and her feet reached the floor, was Tricia Cole herself. Full support. Every resource. Every door, doctor. Amara Osai was promoted to associate attending physician within 6 weeks of the events of October and was given charge of a new diagnostic equity initiative at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center, a program designed to address the specific protocol gaps and systemic biases that had resulted in Diana Cole's condition going undiagnosed for 8 months, and that had shaped the experience of every member of the Cole family in the building on that Tuesday morning. And Amara Osai ran the program with the same focused, uncompromising excellence she had brought to 11 months of being competent and underutilized. Dr. Raymond Holt retired from Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center in January. The retirement was announced as voluntary. The circumstances were not publicly discussed, and Dr. Holt said in his brief retirement statement that he was grateful for his years of service and wished the hospital well going forward. And that was all he said. And it was, in the opinion of everyone who read the statement, significantly less than enough. But it was what was said. And the world moved on. Nurse Patricia Greer remained at Atlanta Pinnacle Medical Center, and Nurse Greer was not fired and was not formally disciplined in any way that the public record documented. And this was, for many people who knew the story, a source of frustration. But Nurse Greer was changed. Not dramatically. People who have been Patricia Greer for 48 years do not change dramatically. But Nurse Greer was changed in the specific small ways that are sometimes the only kind of change that sticks. She had watched a 13-year-old girl in 2 large surgical scrubs do something in a locked hospital room that 20 years of professional certainty had told her was impossible. And she had gone and gotten a chair when Dr. Holt said, "Get this girl a chair." And she had carried the chair to Tricia herself. And she had set it down. And she had gone back to her station. And she had not forgotten the specific sensation of carrying that chair to